Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. Today we are continuing our ongoing coverage of the Russian-Ukrainian war. And today we continue our coverage of the ongoing fighting that is taking place. As I've talked about in previous episodes, I've discussed that we are now seeing a limited Russian offensive operation taking place with the strategy of seizing limited amounts of territory. We believe, again, that the major Russian offensive will take place sometime in late summer. Again, because of the mobilization efforts that have occurred and are ongoing, in all probability, the capability for the Russians to mount the type of offensive that it wants to launch probably will not be ready until late summer. Now, what is it doing right now? It, meaning the Russian military. Well, right now it has affixed Ukrainian forces in these static defensive positions because of the recent operations by the Ukrainian army, both on the western bank of the Dnieper River and to the east and southeast of Kharkov. The Ukrainian armed forces, because of casualties, because of loss of equipment, because of loss of supplies, are in no position right now to launch counteroffensive operations. So they're really focused right now on maintaining the territory that they control. What's interesting is the question must be asked is, why are they being so relentless about defending areas such as Bakhmut and then obviously Sloviansk, Kramatorsk? The U.S. military has even advised the Ukrainian armed forces to pull back from Bakhmut. And thus far, the Ukrainians are not doing it. And one of my theories is why the Ukrainians are fighting for Bakhmut. It's because of the population that's in Bakhmut. Bakhmut is a Russian supporting city. Sloviansk and Kramatorsk, for all intents and purposes, is a Russian-speaking and Russian-supporting cities. The Ukrainians are using these cities, again, these Russian sympathetic cities, as defensive redoubts in defense, ultimately, of what would be Western Ukraine. So again, obviously not everyone in Bakhmut, not everyone in Sloviansk or Kramatorsk supports the Russians. But again, going back to 2014, before 2014, when when what you could call a civil war broke out in Ukraine, again, eastern Ukraine, southern Ukraine, the Crimea, very much supporting Yanukovych, the president that was driven from power through a undemocratic process, through activities on the street. Again, much like, well, I'm not going to compare and contrast that, but again, that is what happened. And at one point, the supporters of Yanukovych controlled Sloviansk, Kramatorsk, Bakhmut, and it wasn't until the so-called ATO, or anti-terrorist operation by Ukrainian forces, that were designating the adversaries in which was rapidly becoming a civil war as a terroristic organization. But now here we sit. Obviously, the Ukrainians continue to defend Bakhmut. Again, very difficult to get public opinion in some of these areas, especially Bakhmut, Kramatorsk. Many of these folks, many of these Russian sympathizers, are absolutely terrified to talk about their opinions, to talk about the fact that they support the Russian Federation. Just the way it is. And it will probably continue that way. Obviously, since 2014 to where we're at now, it has become much more draconian in Ukraine. The concept of being a Russian supporter or being in opposition to what happened in 2014 in terms of removing the elected president from power can get you into prison, or even worse. So again, right now, from just a military perspective, it does appear the Russians have affixed much of the Ukrainian lines. And what they're doing right now, it appears to be just wearing those lines down through the use of lots of artillery and air power. We're starting to see air power again much more being used by Russian forces. You know, earlier in the conflict, in the early days of the conflict, we saw the Russians go after the air defense capabilities of the Ukrainians, but we observed that the Russians were maneuvering quite a bit in the early stages of the war. So the ability of the Russians to provide close air support is much less capable than what you would see in the West, especially the United States. But, however, in the current state of the conflict, where the Ukrainians are in these set defensive positions, running from what would be near Severodonetsk all the way south towards Zaporizhia, these areas are now being targeted and have been targeted for quite some time by Russian forces. And I think at this point, the Russians are prepping the groundwork ultimately for a major offensive operation that will probably take place sometime in late summer. And why is this? Again, yes, the Russians have taken casualties. The early operations by the Russian forces, when this war kicked off, was not prosecuted in a manner that the Russians were going to succeed. If the Russians, according to their intel, believed that the Ukrainians were just simply going to fold, then yes, that strategy probably would have worked. But unfortunately for the Russians, much of the Ukrainian army indeed fought. Now, there were some instances in the south where obviously you saw overwhelming Russian firepower, while at the same time the possibility of Russian intel at work, Russian security services, intelligence services, creating the atmosphere where some of these Ukrainian units may not have fought, specifically near Kherson, the main bridge over the Dnieper River to the northeast of the regional capital of Kherson was not destroyed. This allowed Russian forces to move over the Dnieper River and seize vast swaths of territory west on the western bank of the Dnieper River. But again, right now, as I talked about earlier, and I know I say that a lot, but again, the major Russian operation is probably not going to start until late summer. I still believe right now the Russians are identifying Ukrainian positions and are systematically going after those positions. The Russians have air power, and they have vastly more artillery than the Ukrainian forces. Many of these Ukrainian units are dug in urban areas, such as Bakhmut and other areas as well, with some of these more advanced anti-tank weapon systems that have been provided by the West. So right now we're just seeing the Russians degrade and destroy those units near the line of contact. And we'll probably continue to see that for some time. We will see elements of maneuver operations by Russia. But again, right now, Russia controls the clock. And if Russia is able to prevent the Ukrainians from crossing the Dnieper River, and more importantly, preventing the supply of the Ukrainian army in the eastern Donbass through the use of air power, through the use of cruise missiles, by striking railway networks, going after critical infrastructure, going after supply depots, eventually this eastern Donbass Ukrainian army, both near Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, further to the south and near Zaporizhia, eventually those army corps are going to become so degraded that they are not going to have the ability for what's eventually to come. And that's going to probably be, again, this major Russian operation, this maneuver operation that is going to take place after the Russians have battered the Ukrainian lines long enough. I think that's the Russian strategy. Will it be effective? Will it work? Difficult to say at this point. I believe the Russians hope it is going to work, but ultimately, will it work? Again, we just don't know at this point. Now, we've also heard reports from other content providers that Western Europe is now going to provide the Ukrainians with up to 100 Typhoon multi-role aircraft, multi-role warplanes. Not going to happen. The United Kingdom and Germany and I believe Italy is the primary user of the Typhoon. They've not built that many Typhoon aircraft. They've built several hundred of these. And most of those, and this is all countries using the Typhoon. The United Kingdom just can't hand over 100 Typhoons. It doesn't have that many it has that many to hand over, but that makes up the majority of the UK's Air Force. The United Kingdom has the vast majority of their aircraft are Typhoons, and then they have a small amount of F-35s. But there's no way the United Kingdom is going to hand over 100 Typhoons. Even all the European nations that use the Typhoon are not going to hand over to the Ukrainians 100 Typhoons. Just not going to happen. I don't know where that's coming from or why that's even being said. In all probability, we'll continue to see Eastern, older Russian-made aircraft that were being used in Eastern Europe handed over to the Ukrainians. But again, the Ukrainian Air Force is really not an effective organization at this point. It is doing very little to prevent continued Russian operations. Now, obviously, the drone issue is still omnipresent for the Russians, although reduced because of the electronic warfare capabilities that Russia, the massive amount of electronic warfare capabilities the Russians have moved into the region. Difficult for some drones to operate. We're seeing much less of the TB2 Bayraktar. If you remember early in the campaign, we saw it being used quite a bit. But the Russians have figured this system out, and we don't hear about it as much. Either they've all been destroyed, or it's very difficult for the TB2 to operate over eastern Ukraine at this point. So it's more or less kamikaze drones, different types of smaller drones that are being used that are able to find gaps in the EW environment that Russia has established. But we'll continue to monitor. We'll continue to report. We're watching things very, very closely. We imagine that we will continue to see waves of cruise missile strikes by the Russians and continued air operations by the Russians as well. I think that is the strategy at this point for the Russians. Again, affix the Ukrainian defensive positions, and then identify and then destroy those Ukrainian units in the field close to the line of contact through the use of heavy artillery and air power. And by doing that, that prevents the loss of Russian service members' lives. And I think at this point, it's fairly important for the Russians. But again, we'll have more very, very soon. Thank you for joining us today. More to come. Have a good day.